Welcome to the 106th Annual Meeting and Conference of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and to the plenary session, Illuminating the Black Family in History, a retrospective on Henry Louis Gates, Jr. I'm Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, ASALH's National President. And this summer, in August, I had the distinct privilege of telling Professor Gates, Skip as I call him, that he was the recipient of the association's inaugural Luminary Award. I was able to catch up with Professor Gates in Martha's Vineyard, and I spoke to him in his lovely outdoor surroundings. I'd like to share that special retrospective moment with you today. You are the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. The title of University Professor, for some who don't know, is Harvard's most prestigious endowed faculty position. Your portrait by Yuki Wang hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. You are an award-winning literary scholar and author of well over 30 books on African American literature and history. You have received countless awards, including over 50 doctorates from universities in the United States, Great Britain, Africa, and other places. You are an award-winning filmmaker who has brought Black history to a worldwide audience through your production of more than 24 documentary films focused on people of African descent in the continent of Africa and also in Latin America and the United States. Each February, ASALH announces a theme that will be the focus of Black History Month and will continue throughout the year. The 2021 theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. And it is this theme in 2021 that makes you the perfect recipient. You are the exemplary of our theme. While your subject matter has been indeed wide-ranging, you've never failed to call attention to the Black family. And I use family here broadly and in terminology that is familial, because you explore our ancestral heritage as a people through your writings and documentaries, and our lineage as individuals through your genealogical focus in your wonderful series, Finding Your Roots. There's no one who best exemplifies the spirit of the familial, the story of generations of people. They appear, for example, in your 6-part PBS documentary series, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, which came out in 2013, and which you wrote. You were the executive producer, you hosted it, and subsequently received an Emmy Award, the Peabody Award, the NAACP Award, and many others, the NAACP Image Award, and many others. Likewise, your documentary series on the birth of Black freedom, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, which aired 2019 on PBS, earned you additional awards, as did its related book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow, which was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2019. Your powerful new documentary on the household of faith, the Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song, and the accompanying book, to me is one of your most wonderful, most moving, inspiring books. ASALH is proud of all you've accomplished and all you've given to the world in the name of Black history. You've made extraordinary, truly historic contributions through a lifetime of service in the advancement of popular and academic studies. You walk in the 21st century footsteps of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was a man of wide entrepreneurial spirit. He didn't just write history books to be read. He started a publishing company called the Associated Publishers so that other people's books could be read, published, and written just like him. He wrote a book on African folk tales. Didn't you do something about folk tales? He wrote in newspapers. He spoke on radio. You walk in the 21st century footsteps of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. I present to you the Luminary Award. You are our bright and shining star.
Evelyn, thank you. Thank you so much. This is, I don't know what to say. I'm so moved. I've always admired Carter G. Woodson.
Your enthusiasm for history and conveying it in so many different forms is absolutely contagious. Where does this come from? How did you pick up this passion for knowledge of the past and the love of archival research? Did you have role models, mentors? Because although you were trained in graduate school to be a literary scholar, you appear to have been strongly encouraged to see the world through the mind of a historian. How did you come to embrace this interdisciplinary perspective?
But it might surprise you that the historian I admired so much was Rayford Logan. My father would tell my brother and me about this famous historian who had graduated from Harvard, who would come to the Gates farm in Patterson's Creek, West Virginia, because he was dating Letitia Gates, and it was Rayford Logan. And then when I got to Yale and took my first Afro-American history survey course with William McFeely, 69-70, we read The Betrayal of the Negro. And I realized it was the same man. I couldn't believe it. I thought my father made, him. He told so many stories. I thought he was making it up. And I got to know John Blasingame. I got to know him beginning of my senior year, and then I went to Cambridge Graduate School. Then when I came back, and subsequently joined the faculty as a little baby lecturer, making my way up the scale, I became very good friends, as you know, with John Blasingame. And Blasingame's mentor, one of his mentors was C. Van Woodward, but his real mentor before Van was Rayford Logan. And Blas, to the day he died, called him Dr. Logan. And he never called him Rayford. And so I think of myself as the beneficiary of the having a role model of Rayford Logan, and actually the tutelage every day at Naples Pizza Shop. Every day I had breakfast 6 days a week and lunch with John Blasingame. It wasn't like zipping around the country on the jet. I went to, once a year, I went to the Modern Language Association. That was like going to the AHA. I was there in the archives, and John gave me a tutorial in the archives just day to day when I was authenticating Harriet Wilson's authorship of Iron Egg. Every step of the way, every day, I was there with Blas. I called him B-Man. He called me the Big Gate, ironically, because I was so small and he was so big. And, I would run it. What I'd found, what my theory was, he'd say, try this, try that, try this. He was at home. John was more at home in the archive than he was with human society. And I saw a beauty in the archive through his eyes. The same with William McFeely. I did my first essay for Afro-American history using the Beinecke Rare Book Library and the Bessie Smith papers that they had. And I wrote about Bessie Smith. And I saw that there was a magic there. They had the original Columbia story, the 4-album set of the Bessie Smith story. And I could actually listen to it and be transported in a way that I thought maybe James Baldwin had been when he wrote Stranger in the Village in the Swiss Alps. I love the archive. And so, as you know, I practice history without a license, as we like to say. I have a BA in history, and I'm very proud of that. Summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. But my PhD is not in history. It's in English language and literature from the University of Cambridge, and I made a conscious decision to switch fields. I could have gotten a PhD in history, but I love storytelling, and I wanted to learn how to analyze literary language beyond its content through its form, which I thought was magical, and I still think that's magical. But as far as I'm concerned, I have the best possible preparation for the kind of work I do under the rubric of African American studies. I am an African Americanist, and I'm proud of that designation. Yes, I'm a literary critic. Yes, I have a BA in history, but I'm an African Americanist. I'm to some extent an Africanist, but yeah, I work, as Robert Ferris Thompson used to say, I work both sides of the Atlantic. My mentor at Cambridge was Wole Soyinka himself, and he was the first director of my PhD dissertation. But I'm an African Americanist, and I see the world in a multidisciplinary way through the lens of history and through the lens of literary analysis and criticism. And I think that I, like you, am an heir to the great tradition of black intellection and scholarship at Howard, certainly at Fisk, but also at Harvard, when we remember that Du Bois, Rayford Logan, Charles Wesley, John Hope Franklin, Nathan Huggins, among many, many others, were educated in the history department at Harvard. Astonishingly enough, you wouldn't think that. So that's the tradition that we extend through our Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And I would like to think that the work that I am lucky enough to do as a scholar in publishing in journals where you have to use a lot of post-structural literary jargon like critical inquiry, but through websites like Black History in 2 Minutes, which are free and open to anybody, that I am spreading the word, that I am telling our people's story. I love storytelling. My father was, as you know, a fabulous storyteller. And there are other storytellers you know, like my Uncle Jim, whom you love.
Both of them.
But I wanted to use the latest cutting edge technology to tell our people's story, which is why Anthony and I did Encarta Africana. And we started a .com, which Time Warner acquired, to an encyclopedia that talked. I've written about the talking book. That's a talking encyclopedia, Encarta Africana. And that was pioneering in 1999. TV, documentary. I love documentary. I've been in love with documentary since Kenneth Clark's Civilization, 1969. And I dreamed about making documentary films. And, you know, the Bible says, be careful what you wish for. And I feel blessed. I really do. That's something every day. Part of me gives thanks to God for allowing me to have access to this medium. I can reach millions of people. 2.4 million people watch Finding Your Roots every week. That's incredible. You can I can write a bestseller, but this does not reach 2.4 million people. So I see myself as a vehicle through which our people's stories can be told to the broadest possible audience. And it is with a great deal of gratitude and humility that I accept this award. Thank you.
In thinking about you in a retrospective way, Skip, I want to emphasize your truly long-standing interest in family history, in genealogy, and more recently in genetics. Many in our audience may recall the fascinating conversation we had, which was the marquee event in ASALH's Black History Month Festival this year. You and I actually recorded more than what was possible for us to discuss in the program because of the time constraints we were under. So I want to take our audience today back in time to hear some of that discussion. I thought it would be interesting to hear you talk about themes and people you did not get to feature in our Black History Month Festival. I want to focus on something you do very effectively, Skip, and that is to reveal how all of us are part of the unfolding drama of historical events. We are all part of history. This fact could not be more evident today. Future generations will read about the impact on our lives and our society from the pandemic, COVID-19, and they will learn about how we ultimately got through it. Of course, that chapter is still waiting to be written. But you, Skip, through your PBS series, Finding Your Roots, you are able to bring to life the long gone families of your celebrity guests, their ancestors who have gone unknown and unremembered, their foreparents who were ordinary people, invisible in history books, and yet people connected to consequential historical events. I am fascinated by the way our lives, and by our, I mean all of us, and the lives of our foreparents are entwined with events of historical importance. I think of the radio show host and devoted ASALH supporter, Joe Madison, whose grandfather, as you disclosed to him on Finding Your Roots, his grandfather was one of the infected men left untreated for decades as part of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. We are all the Black family, and we are all part of history. I think of RuPaul, the gay television host, who, by the way, on Sunday, September 19th of this year, won the Emmy for Best Reality Competition Program. His family is particularly timely today as we watch Haitian refugees rebuffed and removed from the Texas border. Yet the facts of history confirm the striking paradox between that image in Texas, the one today, and the one in 1804, after the Haitian Revolution against French rule and the hard-won independence of the first Black Republic. Slave owners in Haiti rushed to a welcoming United States, which had itself fought not long before in a victorious revolution against Britain. Most of the white slaveholders from Haiti who settled in the US went to Louisiana, and they brought with them their human property of Black lives. Let's hear you in conversation with me about your interview with RuPaul.
RuPaul is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, one of the most compelling, the genius. And it'll show you that, we find complicated stories of African-American history that defy simple notions of enslaved and free. RuPaul's maternal third great grandmother was a woman named Nanette Fontenette. And we found a manumission record for her from 1804, signed by a white planter called Jacques Fontenette. And you can tell they're from Louisiana. It frees Nanette and her brother, Andre, 1804. The same year, Haiti, January 1st, 1804, became when Saint-Domingue became Haiti independent republic, the first Black republic in the history of the world, and the great first successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. They're described on the record as being mulatto and the children of Negro Julie, quote unquote. So obviously we speculate on the relationship between Jacques, the white man, and so-called Negro Julie, wondering if Jacques could have been the father of her children. So regardless, Julie is RuPaul's fourth great grandmother. So he descends from freed Black people, free since 1804. Well, we wanted to find what happened to Negro Julie. Negro Julie remained enslaved after her children, Nanette and Andre, were freed. But we found a manumission record from 1818, 14 years later. It reveals that Andre, the son purchased their mother from Jacques Fontenet with the intention of manumitting her. However, Andre died before this could be accomplished. So Nanette fulfilled his wish and manumitted their mother. RuPaul fell apart. He said, and it led him to think about his relationship with his own mother. When my mother was on her deathbed, she called me and she said, Ru, come here, I need you. She was in the living room where I put the bed. And she said, I'm embarrassed about this, but I need your help because I messed myself. And this sounds weird, but it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever done on this planet, to have helped someone who has helped me in that way. Now, he never would have told me that story had not we had shared this story with him. So what is the lesson for historians, professional historians, and your students? The lesson is there are so many more stories fundamental to Black history, surprising examples of intuitive moments in Black history that are buried in your family tree.
I love to watch the reaction of your guests when you introduce them to their ancestors. Most of them have no idea that the generations before them were part of profoundly dramatic historical events. For example, in May 2019, the New York Times featured a story about the discovery of the wreckage of a slave ship named the Clotilda that was submerged deep in waters off the coast of Alabama. It was in the summer of 1860 when the ship docked and unloaded more than 110, some estimates go as high as 160 enslaved men, women, and children, smuggled directly from Africa. After unloading the ship, it was set on fire to sink and thus remain hidden. Finding the wreckage in 2019 of this last known slave ship proved that the slave trade from Africa to America continued illegally for decades after the newly United States Constitution made clear that the importation of Africans would have to end on January 1st, 1808. And there it was in 1860, close to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, for most of us who read the newspaper coverage of finding the Clotilda, the story was both compelling and disturbing. But for musician Questlove, the performer, and the filmmaker of the amazing documentary Summer of Soul, for Questlove, this story became also very personal. Let's watch you, Skip, talking to me about when Questlove appeared on Finding Your Roots. And afterward, we'll watch the excerpt from the actual Finding Your Roots episode.
The last slave ship that arrived in Mobile, Alabama, carrying roughly 110 slaves from the port of Ouida in the kingdom of Dahomey, which is now Benin. The Clotilda, as everyone knows, is the last slave ship to have arrived in the United States on July 9th, 1860. And Charlie and Maggie Lewis were on board. He is one of the few African Americans who knows where his ancestors came from, and they came from Dahomey, which was a huge slave state. We all know now, and we are secure enough to admit that African elites played a crucial role in the slave trade. White people didn't even penetrate the interior of Africa for decades and decades into the 19th century. You ever wonder why Stanley and Livingston was such a riveting story in the newspaper? Because Stanley is looking for Livingston, and Livingston is looking for the origin of the Nile River, in the interior of Africa. Because, there were no roads, you'd die of typhoid, you'd die of yellow fever. or you'd be killed. And so white slave traders established forts along the coast. That's where Europeans were. And African elites would capture other Africans, people we call Africans today, bring them to the coast, then sell them, after war or however they, enslaved other peoples, and then sell them to white people along the coast. And then they would be shipped to the United States. So there's a lot of guilt to be shared in the slave trade. After all, our ancestors from Africa were human, just like everybody else. But when I showed Questlove the identity of his third great grandparents, he broke down and cried. And after emancipation, the people on the Clotilda banded together and formed their own town. That's called. It became known as Africa Town, and it was settled largely by people who, in fact, had sailed here on the Clotilda. And some of Charlie and Maggie's descendants, Questlove's cousins, still live in the area where the family first settled in Alabama. Questlove said, and I quote, "I've never imagined this in my entire life that I'd see this. I just have to keep looking at him," because we showed them Charlie's picture, because those are my eyes, man. Now, Amir, this is an article that's published in a newspaper called The Tarboro Southerner on July 14th, 1860.
Arrival of a cargo of African Negroes. Schooner Clotilda with Africans arrived in Mobile Bay today. A steamboat immediately took them up the river.
On Monday, July 9th, 1860, a ship called the Clotilda arrived in Mobile Bay carrying 110 African slaves. It's the last known slave ship to come to America. Your family settled less than 2 miles from an area, Amir, you ready for this? Known as Africa Town, which was founded by survivors of the Clotilda.
I'm frozen, man.
Every African American that we know wants to know where in Africa they came from and then how they came here. You are the only African American I've ever met who could name the ship.
I'm on the absolute last ship that ever came here.
I'd like to give another amazing example of your ability to utterly surprise your guests with knowledge of their family stories. In this case, the story is about slavery and universities. It isn't commonly known that institutions of higher education, manufacturing companies, businesses, churches were the owners of Black men, women, and children. But institutional slavery was real, and it was prevalent throughout colonial America and in the South right through the Civil War. Institutional slavery ended with the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment. One such case that received a lot of attention in the recent past focused on Georgetown University, a school run by Jesuit priests. An article dated April 16, 2016, appeared in the New York Times, and I quote from the article: "The human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some slaves pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up praying for deliverance. But on this day in the fall of 1838, no one was spared, not the 2-month-old baby and her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. Georgetown sold 272 Black people to pay off its debts. Because of that story, which appeared in many newspapers and galvanized an ever-growing interest in scholarship on the topic of universities and slavery, Georgetown has taken responsibility for addressing the wrongs done. However, you, Henry Louis Gates Jr., brought the story home, at least to the home of Epatha Murkison, and you did so in a powerful genealogical and genetic way. Now, Skip, you know how much I love the television show Law and Order. I still watch the repeats, so I was really excited to see Epatha Murkison on Finding Your Roots. I have great admiration for her as an actor and also because of her advocacy of women's health issues. So with a retrospective eye, let's look at the Finding Your Roots episode with Epatha Murkison, who really had very little knowledge of her four parents' lives or names prior to being on your show.
Epatha Murkison has roots in the Deep South. Her mother was born in the tiny town of Maringouin, Louisiana. And Epatha believes that her ancestors have been in and around Maringouin for generations. But beyond that, the shape of her family tree is a mystery.
I've always wanted to know where we came from. And I have no idea other than Maringouin. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was 16, I got one of those little cassette recorders, mm-hmm. and my grandmother was visiting. And I said to her, we called her Mama Pearl, I said, talk to me about when you grew up. And she was like, no, turn that thing off. You don't want to hear this. Mm-hmm. And I said, I do, I want to know. Mm-hmm. And she said, it's painful. You don't need to hear any of this.
Our researchers were able to discover some of what Mama Pearl withheld. Census and marriage records took us back to Pearl's mother, Epatha's great-grandmother, a woman named Easter Hawkins, and indicated that her parents, Peter and Martha, were both born in Maryland, likely in slavery. That's where the paper trail ran out. We couldn't find records to take us further, but then we noticed something in Epatha's DNA. And suddenly, the wall erected by slavery began to tumble down.
Oh my goodness, okay.
Now, this is a chart showing a genetic network, people who share significant amounts of DNA with you and your mother. Each of these people is related to you in some way.
Oh my God.
So guess what all these people have in common?
What?
You and everybody on that page trace your ancestry to one person. You read the name at the top?
Patrick Hawkins.
Does the name Hawkins ring a bell?
Oh, back.
Yeah, go back to
Easter.
Great-grandmother Easter's maiden name.
Hawkins.
Hawkins.
Wow.
So that means that Patrick Hawkins was more than likely one of your direct ancestors. And since they share a surname, we imagine that he might somehow be connected to Easter, your great-grandmother. Isn't that incredible?
That's amazing.
Just through DNA.
That's amazing.
Now we face the question, how was this man, Patrick Hawkins, born over 2 centuries ago, likely in Maryland, possibly related to Epatha? To find out, our genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore, began searching for a link, combing through DNA databases and comparing those results with records on the paper trail. Through painstaking research, she uncovered a story unlike any we'd ever encountered before. It begins in the archives of Georgetown University, where in 1838, the Jesuit priest who ran the school sold a group of slaves to 2 planters in Louisiana. The documentation of this sale was invaluable because it listed the slaves who were sold by name.
and one name stood out immediately.
Patrick, a man 35 years of age.
Now, you remember all your DNA cousins?
Yes.
Who descend from Patrick?
Yes.
That's Patrick Hawkins.
And that's how they got from Maryland to Louisiana.
He was sold by the Jesuit leaders of Georgetown University to Louisiana planters in the year 1838.
Wow. Okay. It boggles the mind for Georgetown University. A Jesuit priest.
A Jesuit priest selling 272 slaves.
Epatha was still uncertain how Patrick Hawkins was related to her. But that was about to change. Georgetown's archives contained an inventory compiled in preparation for the sale. It lists the slaves that were to be sold according to where they worked, and it identifies their family members.
White Marsh Farm, Isaac about 65 years. Patrick, Isaac's second son, 35 years. Letty, his wife. Peter, his son, 5.
You know what you're looking at? You're looking at the names of your family.
Wow. I'm descendant from these.
These are your people. This is your family tree in that record of slaves.
Wow.
There's your third great-grandfather, Patrick Hawkins. We know his wife's name, Letty.
Letty.
Letty is your third great-grandmother, Epatha. And their 5-year-old son is your great-great-grandfather, Peter.
They have names. That's amazing. Wow. That's amazing. They have names. They're not just faceless people.
Right. They're real people with names, and they had children and grandchildren, and they named them.
Yeah.
And they passed those names down.
Yeah. Wow. This is pretty amazing.
I would be remiss if I did not tell you that this retrospective on you is also a way for Epatha Murkison to express what being on your show meant to her in the passage of time after she received this knowledge from you. In fact, she wants to tell you right now.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and specifically Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, for asking me to be a part of this evening, your 106th conference, and the presentation of the inaugural Luminary Award to Henry Louis Gates Jr. I met Skip over 25 years ago. I used to every now and then host the Hurston Wright Awards. It was a book award. And one year it was moved to New York, and my co-host was going to be Henry Louis Gates Jr. And of course, I'd known everything that I could about this man and his astounding work, and specifically the PBS historical pieces that he produced and narrated. And so I was really tickled when I found out that Skip Gates has a wicked sense of humor. But that's who I see whenever I'm around him. I see someone who has a joyous disposition. And then maybe about 5 years after we did the Hurston Wright Awards, he called and asked, would I be interested in participating in the next season of Finding Her Roots, Finding Your Roots. They were her roots. And I was like, are you kidding? Who would say no to that? And the wonderful thing is my mother is still living. She'll be 95 this year. So she was able to participate as well. And I remember going finally, because that he called around before the second season, but my episode did not air until the fifth season. And so I'm now in Chicago. We're shooting. It's like in January or something like that. And I mean, it's cold. There's tons of snow. And I walk into this location, and my perspective of myself was completely changed in a matter of 2 hours. It was an extraordinary moment. And then, maybe a year or two after that, I was invited by Skip to go to DC for a panel on the show that Cece was going to be on, and Joe Madison. And I got to DC early, so I had some personal time, and it occurred to me to go by Georgetown University. So I asked the driver to take me to Georgetown University. I got out of the car, walked through this huge iron gate. There's the statue of the founder of the university and this huge building. I walk in, there's all kinds of activity swirling around, all kinds of students. And I stop one young woman and say, "Can you please point me in the direction of Isaac Hawkins Hall?" And she shows me how to get there. And I will walk this long hall out of the building. I make the right turn and I walk up this little incline, and there it is. Isaac Hawkins Hall, named after my fourth great grandfather. It was an amazing moment. And I just kept thinking, could he ever have imagined something like this? Or me? And I stood there, I don't know, like 20 minutes. And there was no one around but me. And then I said, let me take some selfies so I can remember this moment. And just as I took a couple of selfies, this young man came out of a building, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, could you please take some pictures of me in front of this sign?" And he was like, "Sure." And I said so proudly, "Isaac Hawkins is my fourth great grandfather." It was an amazing moment. And Dr. Gates, you gave me that moment. So, standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, I thank you from Isaac and Patrick and Letty Hawkins, Peter Hawkins, Nason and Bibby Butler, and the Harrises, Sam and Betsy, that led to my great grandmother, Easter Hawkins, and my grandmother, Pearl Mulmore Bowen, and my mother, Ann Murkerson. You gave us names to stand on and to be proud of. And so that you get this Luminary award, that you receive this tonight, I looked up the word just to have the definition in my brain. And it's a person of prominence and a brilliant achievement. And in your achievement, you have given so many of us family. Thank you for that.
In addition to all you've done in encouraging Black people, and really people of all races, to learn more about their families by interviewing their elderly members, identifying photographs, and conducting genealogical and genetic research, you've also given us a beautiful family portrait in another way. In this case, I'm talking about the Black church, the Black church. In fact, the Black community. As you know, we use the word family mostly in two ways. The first way being when we talk about our nuclear and extended families of real and fictive kin, of parents and children, aunts, uncles, and cousins. But there is a second way. We talk about the family. And we talk about it when we say our church family. We talk about our church mothers. We speak of brothers and sisters in the household of faith. Thus, it is especially fitting to reflect upon your documentary on the Black church. This is my story, this is my song, and the accompanying book that you wrote. They are masterful, rich in the breadth and complexity of Black religious ideas and practices. In that documentary, your visit to your mother's church in West Virginia and your comments to the congregation about your promise to God at the time of your mother's illness moved many of us who watched to tears. So I wanted to ask someone who appeared in that documentary to speak on a personal level to you about the documentary's meaning and impact. I posed the question, how does thinking about the documentary, this is my story, this is my song, become a source of precious memories about your own family? The great musician and social justice advocate, John Legend, wants to give you his answer.
Hello everyone, it's John Legend here. To say I'm humbled to speak with you all today would be an understatement. You know, when I was in high school, I entered a Black History Month essay contest, sponsored by McDonald's. The prompt was, how will you make Black history? And with a 15-year-old's confidence, I declared that I would become a famous musician. This in turn, I wrote, will put me in a position of great influence, which I will utilize in order to be an advocate for the advancement of Black people in America. So believe me when I say that speaking at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History is a deep honor, given that ASALH's mission is squarely aligned with the declaration I made so many years ago. And with that, I'd like to start by acknowledging the many Black people and Black families, both of our past and present, whose stories go untold or overlooked each day. You see, our ancestors knew that telling our stories was a way to pass on the seeds of past growth and wisdom to the next generation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, father of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, knew that through storytelling, we could bear witness to the Black experience. And in doing so, we could advocate for the advancement of Black people in this country. This is also something that my friend, longtime ASALH member and Luminary Award winner, Professor Henry Louis Skip Gates Jr. has done for all of us. Skip, even with all of your awards and accomplishments, it's impossible to measure the impact your work has had on me and on countless other lives. You remind us that our stories are necessary to tell, because in telling them, we can begin to piece together the beautiful, complex tapestry which we call the Black experience. An experience that is as diverse as there are people. Yet when woven together, it tells the story of our collective Black family. And with that, I'd like to share my family's story with you. In many ways, this story begins with my first musical mentor. She was my grandmother, Elmira Lloyd. She was born and raised in the Midwest. She grew up in Ohio and Michigan. She was the daughter of a preacher who later became the wife of a preacher. It's something of a family business. In our church, my grandfather and my uncle delivered the sermons. My mother directed the choir. My father played the drums and taught Sunday school. But my grandmother, Elmira Lloyd, was the heartbeat of it all. In her seat behind the organ, I remember vividly how she and I would hang out at her house on Sundays after church. She would cook collard greens and cornbread, and she'd roast some chicken. And she sat with me at the piano and taught me how to play. It was a gift. Whenever her fingers touched the keys, I heard the whole church in harmony, no matter how small the room. She taught me that performance was not about perfection or simply reciting music note for note. No, at our church, we played in the moment because at any instant, someone might be moved by the power of the Spirit, stand up and give testimony. They might break into song. They might burst into tears. And it was my grandmother's job to ride their emotion, register their energy, then reflect it back on the keys. Before I ever heard Thelonious Monk or John Coltrane or James Brown, my grandmother taught me to improvise, to respond to ambiguity with spontaneity and with grace. It was an invaluable lesson in music, but also in life as a son, a husband, and a father. When I was about 10 years old, my grandmother died suddenly. She wasn't even 60 yet. Our family was devastated, broken. My mother spiraled into depression and struggled with addiction. There was no way to practice or prepare for something like this. We were thrust into new versions of ourselves far too quickly, far too early. The rift in our family felt jagged at the edges for years. But my grandmother taught me, when something unexpected happens, you don't just sit there frozen. You let yourself feel the emotion fully and together. And then you channel it into something beautiful. So with my grandmother in our hearts, my siblings, my dad, and I tried to recreate that same loving home that shaped us when we were younger. And I took over the church music. I kept playing the way that my grandmother taught me, which eventually would lead me to a career as a musician. In every song that I perform today, you can hear my grandmother, not just the sound of gospel, but her resilience, her strength, her empathy, her love. The same love that went into her cooking, went into her piano keys, and went into the hearts of our family and everyone she interacted with. And now, when I look at my kids, my wife, and our beautiful family, we are here because of Elmira Lloyd. And there are so many Elmira Lloyds out there who actively shape our Black families, who bring together our communities, who instill our values, and who inspire us to keep pushing forward. And yet their stories largely go untold. Skip Gates, I want to thank you. Your work celebrates the stories of our families. We got together for your piece on the Black church. And in that interview, you gave me the opportunity to reflect on the influence the Pentecostal church had on my upbringing and on my career as an artist. You gave me the opportunity to reflect on my roots. So when you tell the story of the Black church, you're really reminding us of our agency, of our power, of how we as Black families have always leveraged community to turn adversity into hope, into opportunity. Through your work, you show us how to listen and bear witness to the raw, complex elements of our diverse human experience. The joy, the pain, the laughter, the fear, the resilience, the pride, the exhaustion, and the energy to thrive. In this time, when we are fighting to advance civil rights, fighting for voting rights. The stories of those who brought us here strengthen us. In 2014, when we founded Free America to end mass incarceration and invest in our communities, we also started with stories. Our mantra was to first listen and then act. We invited activists, prosecutors, and people in prisons and jails around the country, as well as their loved ones who'd been sentenced to live without them, to tell us their stories. Those stories guided Free America's programs because we knew policy change needed to be at the forefront of the movement to end mass incarceration. We worked behind the scenes to bring together organizations, elected officials, and other stakeholders to think boldly, to pursue reform. This pursuit brought us to work with Desmond Meade and his team at the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Together, we passed a constitutional amendment that restored voting rights to more than 1.4 million Floridians. A year later, I stood in a Florida courthouse as a judge made it official for a room full of formerly incarcerated people. Some of these people hadn't voted in decades and hadn't really felt connected to their communities at all since their incarceration. But many said that this one moment made them feel like they fully belonged again, like they were part of something bigger. We also knew that the movement required support from an engaged and informed public. So we used storytelling to educate and activate the public on the real world impact of incarceration. We launched #MyPotential, a digital campaign that showcases the personal stories of individuals affected by America's criminal justice system. But we didn't stop there. We also wanted to give people with lived experience with the carceral system the opportunities to thrive once they returned to their communities. So we launched Unlocked Futures, an accelerator that provides grants, technical assistance, and community to entrepreneurs impacted by incarceration who are working to break down barriers to opportunity and break the cycle of incarceration in America. From the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank ASALH for inviting me to speak, and I would like to thank Skip, our Luminary. Many congratulations to you, my friend. Your work and your spirit shines a light on the stories and brings us together as a collective Black family. Thank you so much.
In 2021, with the theme, The Black Family, Representation, Identity, and Diversity, ASALH is proud to bestow its inaugural Luminary Award on you, Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lopez Matthews Jr., and I am the Digital Production Librarian for the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, and also chair of the ASALH TV Committee for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I would like to thank you all for being with us this afternoon for this wonderful program celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Please place your questions in the chat. We understand that during our conversation in February, we did not give you the opportunity to ask Dr. Gates questions. So we wanted to give you this special opportunity to briefly speak with him at our conference. And so as we give you time to place your questions in the chat, we're going to hear from ASALH National President Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham.
Hello, everyone. I'm just so pleased to bring you this program today, because this is ASALH's first National Luminary Award plenary. You know, in 2021, ASALH decided to pay tribute to a person of national and even international renown, one who represented the Black history theme in a special way. And so at this national level, we inaugurated this Luminary Award. And I couldn't be more pleased and more proud of my colleague, Henry Louis Gates Jr. Back to you, Lopez.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks Higginbotham. And I'm going to begin with our first question, which is sent to, of course, Dr. Gates. And it is, are you planning to conduct research on your own family for an episode of Finding Your Roots? And are you planning on writing an autobiography?
Oh, the answer is yes. We've already done a lot of research. First of all, this is an overwhelming experience, Evelyn. It's mind-boggling, really. I hadn't seen the video before, ladies and gentlemen. So I watched it in real time with you, and it was just, I couldn't believe it. Seeing the Questlove clip, Apatha, and her kind words, and John, whom I love, it was just deeply moving. And so thank you. I mean, this is one of the greatest awards that anyone could receive, and certainly one of the greatest awards that I've received. And with all humility, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Frederick Douglass famously wrote that family trees don't grow in slavery, but that's not true. Now, you know, with the combination of the digital revolution and DNA, we can get beyond the brick wall of the 1870 census for many, many people and find your ancestors deep into slavery. And I think everybody, all Black people should trace their family tree. All Black people should trace their ancestry using DNA. I feel very, very strongly about that. Evelyn, my motto for Finding Your Roots is Ezekiel 37, I believe. I know you'll correct me. Son of man, can these bones live? How do these bones live? They live through storytelling, and the storytelling through genealogy and genetics. So that's for me, the motto of Finding Your Roots, how to make the bones of our ancestors, as it were, live. And I'll give you one example. The oldest Gates is Jane Gates, the oldest Gates on our family tree. Jane Gates, my great-great-grandmother, she was born in 1819. She died January 6, 1888 in Cumberland, Maryland, which is about halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington. My family, for 200 years, on all sides, has lived in a 30-mile radius of Cumberland, Maryland. And we knew she had 5 children. They all looked white. And we had a theory about who the man was who fathered her children. In other words, my white great-great-grandfather. She never revealed his identity. She just told her children that they all had the same father and that he was white. So, you know, my cousins, everybody speculated on who this guy was. And now we know through DNA, C.C. Moore, our genetic genealogist, she spent years triangulating and finally tracked this guy down. And we're going to have a family reunion in Cumberland, Maryland. And all the Gateses, all my cousins, scattered all over the country, are going to come. And C.C. Moore is going to reveal the identity of we knew he was of Irish descent because of my Y DNA is the O'Neill haplotype. And 10% of all the men in Dublin and I have the same Y DNA signature. So there was no question about that. But we actually know who he is. We know his name. And that's a mystery that Jane Gates took to her grave on January 6, 1888. And now through DNA, a combination of DNA and genealogy, we have solved that mystery. And so I did a memoir in 1994 called Color People. It ends when I went off to Yale as an undergraduate. And now I'm going to do a new edition and talk about all I know about my ancestry, which I didn't know when I wrote that book all because of the genealogists at Finding Roots have done my ancestry. So on the Gates line, we can go back to Jane Gates and this white dude. Hello, welcome to the family, great-great-grandfather. But on my mom's side, we could go, and on my father's mother's side, we could go back to 3 sets of my 4th great grandparents who were free by 1823. 2 sets were free by the American Revolution, and one, John Redmond, my 4th great grandfather, was a patriot. He mustered into the Continental Army on Christmas Day in Winchester, Virginia, 1778, and was mustered out in the spring of 1784. And because of him, my brother, Dr. Paul Gates, who was a retired oral surgeon, former chief of dentistry, Bronx Lebanon Hospital. My mother, looking down, would smack me on my head if I didn't give my brother a plug. My brother and I were inducted to the Sons of the American Revolution, and my daughters were into the Daughters of the American Revolution. And he was a black man who was freed by the American Revolution. I had no idea. And all of these 3 sets of 4th great grandparents who were free lived 30 miles from where I was born on September 16, 1950. You know, I'm looking to the east across the Atlantic trying to find Kunta Kinte on my family tree, and my roots were right under my feet in eastern West Virginia in the Allegheny Mountains on the Potomac River, back to the founding of this republic. That is the power of tracing your family tree.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that story. That's wonderful to hear, that you were able to sort of find so much about your family. Those of us who are interested in finding our family histories, we find it sometimes difficult to find. And technology has helped us. But our second question is in that area. And they ask, what words of guidance can you offer to African Americans about how to teach history in their families in an effort to reclaim lost memories of the past? As we know, sometimes this can be painful.
Well, the first thing to do is to find the oldest members of your family right now and do 2 things. Have them take a DNA test and start to record them. As Apatha said, sometimes it's very difficult because people don't want to go back in the past. And their experiences were often very painful. And we all know that. When you discovered that you were black, and often it was a very painful thing. Someone called you the N-word, or there was some kind of deprivation, some kind of lack. Du Bois famously talks about a little white girl visiting his school in Great Barrington and won't take his greeting card. We all had that kind of experience. We need to get those stories down. If someone, now there's no excuse. You can do it on your iPhone, on your mobile device. Just hit a button and the recording's fabulous. Just get people telling the story. And it doesn't matter if the stories are true or not. Record all the stories. We all have stories. We're descended from your great-great-grandmother had high cheekbones and straight black hair, right? And she was a Native American. Whatever. Just get them down, get them transcribed. But also seek out help. Go to, if you're in a city, every major city in the United States has a genealogical society. Right here in Boston, it's the New England Historic and Genealogical Society on Newberry Street. You can walk in off the street. I mean, when they're open now, it's because of COVID, everything is either virtual or has mixed hours. But find out, go into your genealogical society and ask them for help. And there are all kinds of local African American genealogical societies. And I'm sure ASALH is connected to these African American focused genealogical societies, and they will give you advice. If you have the means, you can also engage the services of professional genealogists who focus on, specialize in African American genealogy, and they will help you. But it's not that hard. I mean, you really can go online through Family Search or Ancestry.com, which I have to say is our lead sponsor for finding your roots. So I'm not allowed to endorse any genealogical service. But these are gateways to the billions of records that have been digitized. You just go in and you type the name of your grandmother, grandfather, and it connects you immediately to documents with that person's name on them. And it's exhilarating. if you're in Washington, you can go to the National Archives, which is, I've filmed there. Talk about a charge you get when they took me there and showed me my fourth great grandfather's pension application. That was, I burst into tears, to see this record, or to see 7 members of my mother's family were in the U.S. colored troops. The Cliffords, J.R. Clifford was one of the co-founders of the Niagara Movement. The second meeting of the Niagara Movement was in Harper's Ferry. Well, he's my grandmother's uncle. So that's our family. And to be able to connect yourself to historical personages that you'd read about it in the pages of From Slavery to Freedom, John Hope Franklin and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's Bible of African American history is a miracle. And you can, everybody can trace your ancestry. Everybody can trace your ancestry. You just have to get started.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us and giving that bit of inspiration. And I'm going to go to another question here, and it says, storytelling, memoir, community history, or autobiography is a decision I must make. What would be the best method to serve my community in terms of doing this type of research?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you at the end. Could you repeat that?
Basically, she wanted to know what you think was the best way to present the information that you find in your research. What do you think is the best way to present that information?
Well, the first thing you have to do is create a narrative with your own family and share it. Most of us now have family reunions, and we have to share that information that you discover in your research with your cousins, your aunts and uncles, your parents, your grandparents, depending on your age. It needs to be collective enterprise. You need to talk to your cousins and the other members of your family who are interested to share their recollections of events since they were born, and also stories that they heard from your ancestors, stories about their ancestors. So it becomes a collective family project. Then you have to assemble the photographs, which now we can do digitally so easily. And so you produce a big family album, starting with your generation and going up the rungs of your family tree, so that you can have a narrative record and a visual record. Then publish it in narrative form and distribute it. Again, you can do this. You don't need a publishing company. You are a publishing company with the internet. So that you publish your own family history and share it with your family. I think you should give copies to the Moreland Spin Guard, to the National African American Museum, to the Library of Congress, to the Schomburg Library in Harlem, so that your family's history is part of American history. So that is the goal. The goal is to reassemble the fragments of all these stories about your ancestors for your own people, for your own family, share them at your next family reunion. It might take you a couple years. Produce a kind of bound volume or digital volume to distribute to your family, and then get your family's record recorded in the library networks of this country, so that your ancestors live forever, which is a way of giving a longevity, eternal life, as it were, to them and to you as well. I mean, eternal life, not in the biblical sense, but in the sense of the living record that remains in a library as long as civilization persists and we have libraries. So your family will always be remembered. I think that's very, very important, because telling your story is part of telling, as John Legend said, the collective story of Africa America, the collective narration of African American history. We are part of the larger saga. You don't have to be descended from Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or Booker T. Washington or Mary McLeod Bethune to be a Black history maker. Just the fact that you're here means that your ancestors were Black history makers, and their story needs to be preserved. And it won't be preserved unless you tell it. That is your obligation. That is your responsibility. And truth of the matter is that is your exhilaration, because there is no joy like discovering your ancestors.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for the shout out to Moreland Spingarn Research Center and to archives and libraries in general.
Hey man, I used to go down Piedmont, West Virginia, my hometown. Now I guess it's about 3 hours west of DC. When I was a kid, it was about 8 hours because you had to go on Route 50 through those mountains. And in the summer, I would go home to Piedmont to be with my parents. A Blasingame, John Blasingame, the great historian, whom I mentioned and who was celebrated in the marvelous video tribute that Evelyn, by the way, you have a future as a documentary producer, my darling. you are really, really good. Blasingame would go down to the Moreland Spin Garden, and I would drive down from West Virginia early in the morning. I'd go to Sterling Brown's house on Kearney Street. Is that how you say it, Evelyn? Kearney Street? Kearney Street? Evelyn?
Kearney Street.
Kearney Street in the Southwest, right?
After Stephen Kearney, but one of these military people in American history. Kearney Street.
Yeah, and that's in Southwest, right?
Northeast.
Oh, Northeast.
Kearney
Well,
Street, Northeast.
Okay. Well, I was.
This is where I lived,
Northeast.
you mean, where Sterling Brown and everybody lived?
Yes, and I would drive down there and have breakfast with Sterling Brown.
Yeah, he
And
lived
Sterling would get
2
out
doors
some
from me.
Kellogg's. Oh wow! I didn't know you at that time. And he would pour me a Kellogg's cornflakes with some milk, and he would have a glass of sherry. And if I wanted a second bowl of cornflakes, he would then shift to bourbon. And he would tell me fabulous stories. And then I would meet Blasingame for lunch at the Moreland Spin Garden. And I tell you, Evelyn, that place was just magic. When you go in there and you thought the records of our people, the saga, the great saga of the African-American people is here, buried, preserved, living, breathing, waiting to be discovered in the archives, in the papers assembled at the Moreland Spin Garden. It is one of the greatest libraries in the world, and I love it. Some of my fondest memories as a young scholar were forged right there in the Moreland Spin Garden. So, yep, I'm an eternal fan of the Moreland Spin Garden.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate the shout out. The next question we have kind of relates to that, especially as you said, people putting their own histories in libraries. They asked, have you considered doing a series of finding your roots for ordinary people or for regular people, kind of highlighting the stories of everyday African Americans?
I'm asked this all the time. For obvious reasons, right? I mean, every day, virtually, we get letters saying, how about me? Well, the thing is, the only reason people watch, or the primary reason people watch, is you want to see the hidden stories of famous people. And that's just the rule of the marketplace. So, and we have to have corporate sponsors put up about half of the money. And so we have to lead with famous people like John Legend or Questlove or Ipatha Murkison. But a few years ago, we had a competition for the quote unquote average person, and we're going to do that again. And even when we did it back in 2006, 2007, we had 2,000 video entries. People uploaded their video entry. Now imagine how many more we have now. We have 2.4 million people, as I mentioned to Evelyn, watching Finding Your Roots on average every week. And obviously a significant percentage of those are African-American people. So how in the world we would decide, I don't know. But we want to do more and more of that, particularly online, with their online feature, with just quote unquote normal, regular African-American people, because The story of your ancestors is just as dynamic as the story of the ancestors of John Legend or Epatha Murchison or Questlove or Oprah or whomever it might be. So stay tuned, watch. We'll be announcing that very soon.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure everyone will be excited and on the lookout for that contest. Our next question is a bit of a interesting one to me. They ask, what would you say or ask an ancestor if you could speak to any ancestor? Who would you select and what do you want to know?
Oh, wow, that's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
No one's ever asked me that before. What would you say? You know what? At the end of Finding Your Roots, and when we film these guests, we film for 4 or 5 hours. You know, you get to see 30 minutes on the TV show because we boil it down to the best stories and the best reactions in 30 minutes. But I'm with those guests for 4 or 5 hours. And at the end, when I give them their full family tree, I say, if you could go back magically in time and meet one of the ancestors, just one of the ancestors to whom you've been introduced today, who would it be? And I'm always surprised at the answer. So this is a variation on that. I would go back and ask John Redmond, what was it like to show up as a black man bearing arms against the British when those white patriots saw your black face? Did they welcome you into the Patriot Army? Did they want to give you access to guns? Did they treat you like an equal? And you know the answer, ladies and gentlemen. You know the answer, no. All of our ancestors suffered anti-black racism. And so after I heard that story, I would say, why did you want to risk your life for the creation of the United States of America when slavery was still a fundamental part of the DNA of what would become the American Republic? Why didn't you run away when Lord Dunsmore in 1775 said, if you're enslaved and you join the British, you're automatically free? The Americans didn't do that. Why didn't you do that, great-great-great-great-grandfather? And when you got out of the Continental Army and the United States of America was a country, and they still, in Virginia, which is where he lived, West Virginia wasn't born until June 20th, 1863, they wouldn't let you vote. They wouldn't let you vote, and you would risk your life for the creation of the American Republic. What gave you hope? Did you have any regrets? Did you ever think about, like some people in our region in 1826 participated in the American Colonization Society's repatriation of black people to Liberia? I mean, we have records of people from Romney, West Virginia, which is about 15 miles from where I grew up. Why didn't you do that? Were you ever tempted to do that? Did you ever lose faith? Did you ever imagine that, you know, you would have generations of lawyers and doctors and dentists, my cousins, my brother, in your family tree? What kept you going? How did you maintain your optimism, your belief that things would get better for your descendants? That's what I would ask, and that's who I would ask. I would ask John Redmond, without a doubt. And then, and if I could go back and meet an ancestor, I would also stop by 1885, a year before Jane Gates passed, and say, Jane, Grandma, I know you try to keep it secret, but we found out the man's name. We're going to out you, Grandma. I'm sorry. And I hope she would be amused.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go next to Dr. Brooks Higginbotham, who has a question for you related to that.
Right, it is related. Just one small thing. I think one reason, and it's certainly not the only reason, but one reason people stayed here and wanted to make their home in the United States rather than just leaving is because of their families, because of that heritage that they had in this country, and families that were there and some still enslaved. But that's not the question I want to ask you. The question I wanted to ask you was, and it's related to like finding that ancestor, because on your show sometimes your white celebrities find that they have Black ancestors. So I'd
Right.
love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think that they have a moment. Some of them have heard stories that there might be a Black ancestor. Roseanne Cash. Roseanne Cash, Johnny Cash's daughter. She had, heard a story that there might have been somebody passing on her mother's side. And in fact, Johnny Cash in 1965 was accused of having married a Black woman. And when you look at those photographs, man, if we were in, Walden Methodist Church and passed it around, people said, yeah, definitely she's a sister. But they, of course, denied it. And we did a family tree. And of course, she was Black, and her ancestors, one of her ancestors had decided to pass, and she was descended from that ancestor. Rebecca Halser, Peter Hall's daughter in the new season of Finding Your Roots. She is the director of she took Nella Larson's novel Passing and made a film about it, which had just premiered. And her mother is an opera singer from Detroit. And her grandfather decided to pass. And her great-grandfather was a friend of Frederick Douglass. Her great-grandfather there was a dinner in honor of Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. in 1883, and her great-grandfather was chosen to give the toast to Frederick Douglass. And we had a record of the toast. We had her read it. And she broke down and cried. And his son, as soon as the father died, his son Norman said, I'm out of here. And he said he was a Sioux Native American, descended from a Native American chief. And he was descended from a Black man who was very, very prominent in Washington, D.C., and whose obituary was recorded in the Washington Bee. But Johnny Cash himself, Roseanne Cash, also inherited African ancestry from her father's side. So Johnny Cash, too, had a distant African American ancestor in his family tree. It's much more common than one would think.
Well, thank you for that answer, and thank you for that question, Dr. Brooks Higginbotham. And our final question, which I think is a good question to end on, is what do you say to people who are of the opinion that history is boring or history doesn't matter?
Oh, my goodness. I'd say they need to read From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham on Righteous Discontent. Evelyn's seminal, brilliant book. Evelyn is a fabulous storyteller, as you can see from this film and in our question and answer session. Or read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which is mind-boggling. History is narrative. It is bringing the past back to life through storytelling. And so if a person believes that history is boring, they've either had a boring teacher or they just haven't opened the right history book. Among broader American historians, Jill Lepore, Evelyn's colleague in the history department, my colleague here at Harvard, she's a fabulous storyteller. David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass is a page turner. There's so many more. I mean, I don't even want to leave anyone out, but there's so many great historians who have told our people's story in a vivid, riveting way, and who will. I think that if you would start reading historical narrative to your children, like bedtime stories, and there are lots of children's books written by historians that bring our people's story to life. I think that you should tell each of our children once upon a time, all the standard fairy tales, but also the story of Phyllis Wheatley and the stories of Harriet Tubman and Harriet Jacobs and Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison and W.E.B. Du Bois and Equiano. Those stories should be part of our children's education, not only at bedtime, but in Sunday school. I think Sunday school should be Black History School. I think we have this built-in structure already, and I think that I'm sure the ASALH does it already, but being able to give laypersons packaged Black history lessons for preschool kids and elementary kids and middle school kids and high school kids, I think that would breathe life into Sunday school in the same way that Jewish people have Hebrew school. One of our producers is Japanese, and her kids go to Japanese school on Saturday. You're not going to get the story of the Hebrew children and the story of Japanese people in our public schools, right? Those groups make sure that their people's history is taught to their kids through their own institutions, and we have the church. So, and I don't know a minister who would not welcome that kind of collaborative arrangement with ASALH. And as I say, it's probably going on right now. But I think that is one of the most important things that we could do. And we are going to continue to fight voter suppression, the rise of anti-Black racism, which has complicated causes, but one of them was, we have to admit it, the fact that lovely, beautiful, brilliant Black family occupied the White House for 8 years, which basically drove a lot of our fellow Americans totally crazy. And you can see it in the rise of anti-Black racism, the rise of voter suppression. That's how Reconstruction ended. They took away the right of Black men to vote through what was called the Mississippi Plan, which spread throughout each of the other former Confederate states. In 1898, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1904, after Louisiana ratified its new constitution, state constitution, that number was reduced precisely to 1,342. From 130,000 to 1,342 in 6 years. That's how quickly voter suppression can obliterate our rights. And to get the right to vote back, that's what Pettus Bridge was all about. That's what the Voting Rights Act, signed in August 1965, was all about. And now these Republican legislatures are trying to take it back. So we have to be vigilant. Black history is alive. And we have to keep, history repeats itself, as was famously said. But in terms of the nefarious parts of history repeating itself, history repeats itself only if we let it. And we have to be aware of how white racism has been used, has been summoned against our rights all through the history of the American saga. And we are at a crossroads once again when people are trying to deny us our fundamental rights. So we have to be vigilant. And the only way we can be vigilant is to know the painful as well as the exciting and noble and exhilarating aspects of the story of the African American people in the American Republic.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I'm going to go to Dr. Brooks Higginbotham next to see if she can give us a comment on that as well.
Yeah, and these are my final words. What do you say to people who are of the opinion that history is boring? Join the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and you will be without a doubt knowing that history is exciting, that we have all kinds of wonderful programs, that we work with youth, we work with the National Park Service, we work with people like Skip Gates. We do all of the things to make history exciting And we must be good at it because we've been doing it for 106 years. The
Amen.
father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, knew history was exciting. And he did all kinds of things to make it even more exciting. Like I mentioned, reading, writing, promoting, publishing, researching. But we in the 21st century have ASALH TV. We still have all of the things that Woodson started. Black History Month. How could history be boring when you've got the Association for the Study of African American Life and History? Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. This is one of the truly great honors of my life. This beautiful, lovely trophy. Thank you. You've blown my mind today, Evie, and I love you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I also want to just say very quickly that we want to thank all of the people who have helped us with this particular program. Our Florida co-host coalition, we thank you. John Legend gave a shout out there in Florida. We're proud of all the work you're doing. I want to particularly thank also Ryan Heathcock, who helped to, in a very big way, put this video together for us. And I want to thank everybody involved, especially John Legend and Epitha Murkerson, and of course you, Lopez. Thank you.
Thank you, Lopez.
Oh, thank you both so much. And I just want to recognize that this program is a part of our 106th annual conference. And so I would like to thank our sponsors who you see on the screen. So thank you all for supporting the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And for those of you who are watching, if you are not subscribed to ASALH TV, remember to subscribe to ASALH TV. We have great programming for you related to African American history. We have series that direct you to resources and special projects that are looking at African American history and illuminating the story of the African American experience. So please subscribe to our channel, support ASALH. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.